All right. Well, hello. I'm going to talk a little bit about soldering today. Um, we're working on our tool trays, and we've got these seams out here that we need to solder, these tabs. So I want to talk about soldering. How do you solder a seam in sheet metal? Well, some of the things we've got here, I've got a couple scrap pieces of sheet metal. So we're going to use that. I've got some paper towel. That's just nice and dry. I'm going to use that. I've obviously got some solder. And this solder, I don't know if you can see that very well, right there above my finger. It'll tell you what it is. This solder is 50% tin and 50% lead, right? The SN and the PB there. And it has a flux core. So if you can see that little center of the core right there, it's got flux in it right there. So I'm not going to need to use, I could add a separate flux paste, but I won't really need to do that unless I run into some trouble. I'm going to wear gloves doing that. I've got some clamps, and of course I've got right here a hot soldering iron right there. So we'll be careful not to bump that. All right, so what do I do first? Well, I'm going to take my practice pieces of sheet metal, and I'm just going to take the dry paper towel and clean those up. This is new sheet metal, so I don't need to sand it too much. I don't need to wire brush it. If you had dirty metal, obviously you need to clean that up. But this just has a little bit of oil on it because it's new. So I'm going to clean off that oil, and then I'll clamp this together. So clean up my sheet metal there, and I'm going to take a clamp. I'm going to use this one. It's kind of a wide nose clamp. So I'll put it together like that. If I was doing my tool tray, I like this style. This works pretty good to go ahead and clamp right there on the corner. Works good. So make sure you got to get these cleaned up in between. If there's oil in between the two layers, try to get a paper towel in there and clean that up the best you can. Then throw a clamp on it. So here's my seam, and this is what I want to solder right here. Once I solder this, it's not going to be chemically fused like a weld would be, where you're actually melting the metal together. Solder is a third material that you're just putting on top. So I'm going to go ahead and put my gloves on. I want to make sure I wear gloves before I start handling the flux and the solder. This flux is an acid-based. Acid core, it says right there. So, and it's 50% lead. So good reasons to wash your hands, wear gloves, all that good stuff. This is a pretty heavy roll. This is 5 pounds when it's new. So that's kind of awkward to hold that. So I'm going to cut off a piece. I've got some snips right here. It's pretty soft stuff. So I will just cut off a piece of solder. If I was soldering my tool tray, I don't need too much solder, usually about 1.5 inches per seam right here. If you use 1.5 inches of solder, that should be more than enough. So that would be 3 inches, 6 inches for the whole tool tray. I don't have to do the inside. I'm just soldering around here on the outside a little bit. So keep that in mind. If you run into spots or you have some solder that you want to move around, then you'll have to add a little bit of paste flux just to coat your seam, right? I could add a little bit right there on the seam, and that's how I would do that. But this is acid core solder, so I don't really need to add any additional flux. So I've got my solder here. If it's long enough, you can hold it with your glove. If it's not, if it gets really short, then just grab it with a pair of pliers and hold it that way. Don't burn your fingers on this soldering iron. It's pretty warm, right? So this is plugged in. It's been heated up for a while, and let me make sure that I've got a good shot here. There you go. You guys see that okay? All right. And I'm going to add a little bit of solder. I'm going to warm up the metal. So the first thing I did was clean it with the paper towel. Then I clamped it. And now I'm heating up the metal. I want to get a little bit of heat into that. And then I'm going to add a little bit of solder. There we go. You'll see a little smoke or a little steam, right? That's the flux burning. Make sure when you see that happening, make sure your face isn't directly over it, because all that smoke, that vapor from the flux burning, that's not good stuff to be breathing in large quantities. So just get your face out of the way. All right. There we go. That's starting to melt there. Okay, so once I get some solder on here, then I can use my iron and push it around. There we go. See that flowing now? It should flow nice and smooth. Okay, I've got some spots here at the beginning. Let's stop. Let's go back. So I don't need to add any more flux, any more solder right now. I can just use what I've got. Just kind of push that around, manipulate it. Just spread that out a little bit. You can tip your work so that way the solder flows down in between the two pieces, right? If this is kind of liquid, once I get it heated up, so if I tip it, it's going to run this way. Can you see that flowing? And I can pretty much pull it right down to the bottom of my joint. So I added a little bit of solder, but then I can pull it the rest of the way. You don't have to add new solder the whole way. Okay? So I went about halfway and then I pulled it the rest of the way. If I wanted to do this corner right here, let me set my soldering iron down for a moment. I'm going to take my clamp and I'm going to turn it. Let's see. Let's find a way that this wants to sit. Nope, that doesn't want to sit there. Ah, that'll work. Okay, so now I can pull it around this corner, and it'll run down this seam right here. That's what I'm going to solder next. Okay, so let's see if I got any solder left over up here that wants to run around the corner. Get it warmed up. See if I can pull any around the corner. Nope, not really. So I'll add a little bit of new solder, and I can use gravity to pull that right down the hill for me, right? I get a little bit going. It starts flowing right down the hill. When I am soldering my tool tray, just keep that in mind. You don't want to add a lot of extra solder. You want to solder that tab that you bent. It should be on the outside of the end of your tool tray. What do you think? All soldered? Okay. So when I'm soldering my tool tray, you can see on this one, was not very well done. The solder doesn't come all the way to the corner. I need to touch that up a little bit. And this top too. So they just kind of soldered the middle. They didn't do a very good job. This is not smoothed out. There's a lot of extra solder there that could be removed. So how would you do that? Well, once you're soldering, you clean it up. After the solder is cool, you can go back to your paper towel. I've got my piece right here. It's a little bit warm. It's not too bad. I can handle it with my gloves on. You see all this black residue. It's a little bit greasy. That's the flux. So I'm going to go back and take my dry paper towel, move my soldering iron out of the way so I don't burn myself there. I'm going to use my paper towel and just kind of clean this up. Try to get, you can see there's flux coming off of there. So just kind of clean that up a little bit. Remember not to get it on your bare hands. That's not a good idea. The nice part is we're wearing masks these days, so that may actually be beneficial here to help from all that vapor going up your nose and that. So you get that cleaned up, and you notice there's not much of a hole. I don't know if we can see this. Can you see that on camera? There's not much of a hole along there. I've got a nice good solder joint. So that's what I want. And if I do a really good job, I can actually blend this together. And after you paint it, if you do a real nice job cleaning up the solder, it's really hard to see how the ends of your tool tray are even put together if you do a nice job cleaning that up. So after I get all the extra flux off, I've got a piece of coarse sandpaper. This is about a 180 grit there, it says. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to sand any of the extra solder. I can sand that up, get it nice and smooth. I'm not going to sit here and sand solder all night for you, but you get the idea. Any of this solder that's extra, you can see I've got a couple extra little areas right here, right there. I could smooth those out, right? If you take your fingernail, once you're sanding this off, if you take your fingernail and you go across the joint, if it doesn't catch, that's a well sanded joint, all right? But if you're catching lumps of solder, then you probably have a little more sanding to do. If you're catching the edge, you should be able just to blend that solder out real nice. Solder used to be used pretty often in auto body, back when cars were metal or steel, and they did a lot of solder in the body shop, and that gave them a nice place to lay their primer and their paint on. Now things are plastic and fiberglass and all kinds of different materials, so they use a lot of body filler. But anyhow, sheet metal solder is really nice. So sand that up, spend some time. If you have a lot of scratches when you're done with the coarse sandpaper, well, then we just shift grits and we go down to a finer sandpaper. So it takes a little bit of time. There, I've got that sanded up. I can do a little bit more on this corner right here. Let's see if I get that sanded down for you guys. If you have a lot of extra solder, then you need to go back, warm it up with the iron, and smooth out some of those lumps. That's what I would do with that. We'll see if we get some of this soldering cleaned off there. All right. So you got the idea. You can see that starting to blend in really nice in this spot right here. So let me switch. I've got a piece of fine sandpaper, and this is, I think it's a 500. I missed some of the number there, but I think it's a 500 grit. So that's pretty smooth. And I'll take this, and this will take out some of the heavy scratches that I put in from the coarse sandpaper. So now I'll sand it down with a fine sandpaper. Because we're using flux and we're using solder on the end of our tool tray, I would strongly recommend, before you paint it or put a finish on your tool tray, I would strongly recommend that you take some sort of thinner mineral spirits, denatured alcohol, any of those thinners, and wipe down your tool tray. Paint thinner works really good. Anything like that, just get a little bit on a paper towel or a rag and wipe down the areas, especially that, wipe over that solder. Get that flux residue off of there, because a lot of times we see that spot will come right through the paint and it won't be hidden at all, no matter how well you sand it. You get that flux residue. You can see this one never got a paint. It's pretty rusted. And that's because of the flux etching the metal. So it's a fun hobby. Good way to put together sheet metal. Make sure you wash your hands when you're done, and do take precautions. All right, the lead in the solder and the acid in the flux is not stuff that you want on your skin for a good amount of time, and be careful. All right, so that's a little demonstration on how to solder, and there's my sheet metal.